Good afternoon, class. My name is Professor Gardevoir, and in today's video, I'll be ranking all 18 Pokemon types by usage. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, all trainers have their types that they tend to favor, but I wanted to see which types I use the most in all the mainline Pokemon games. So I went through the entire Pokedex, listed out all the Pokemon I used in a playthrough, and got into the Hall of Fame in order to see which types I use the most. So without further ado, here are all 18 Pokemon types, from least used to most used. The type I've used the least is the Rock type, with only 4 Rock Pokemon ever getting into the Hall of Fame, which was honestly 2 more than I initially remembered. This placement doesn't surprise me, though. I've always considered the Rock type to be pretty useless in most playthroughs. You can usually get one early to help with normal and flying types, but with its weakness to water and grass, 2 very common types in all the games, they quickly drop off. They're also weak to fighting, steel, and ground, but at least their high defense can sometimes help with that. Their special defense, however, is garbage, making even neutral special attacks do heavy damage to them. And on top of that, they're slow. The slowest type of them all, in fact, on average. They may have the second highest defense on average, but like I said, special defense is a huge weakness for them. Because of that, I rarely ever use a Rock type outside of HM purposes, which aren't even in the game anymore. It's kind of a shame because I do like the Rock type. I think a lot of Rock type Pokemon are cool and designed well, and in theory they should be a defensive wall, but in practice they are anything but. I mean, they resist 4 types and are weak to 5. That's not a defensive typing. Compare that to Steel, which resists over half the types at 10, and is only weak to 3. That's a defensive typing, and pretty much made the Rock type pointless in most cases. I hope the Rock type gets some buffs in the future so I can use them more. Next up is the Ghost type, at 6 Pokemon getting into the Hall of Fame. This also doesn't surprise me. The Ghost type is a bit on the rare side. And the number 2 seems to be the magic number with the Ghost type, as it's super effective against 2 types, resists 2 types, is immune to 2 types, and is weak to 2 types, one being itself. I know many people may disagree with me on this, but I kind of find the Ghost type to be a bit boring. Not in terms of design, I think the designs are fantastic. I mean in battle. Most of the time I would rely on things like Curse and Will-O-Wisp to do damage, as most Ghost types are defensive. Oh, don't believe me? Well, the Ghost type is ranked the 6th most defensive type and 5th most special defensive type on average. They're also the 5th ranked in terms of special attack, meaning that some can dish out serious damage, but since they only beat themselves and Psychic types, I don't find myself using them that much, because that basically means that they're only really good against Psychic types, as they can get taken out by their own type. They do have a lot of support and tricky moves, which can be fun, but are also kind of gimmicky in playthroughs, so yeah, I don't use them much. Next up we have the Dragon type at 7 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. I'm sure most expected the Dragon type to be on the lower end of this list because of how rare they are, but unlike the Ghost type, this is a type I actually want to use, but can't because they're so rare and so hard to get up to their final form. This makes sense though, as on average the Dragon type is one of the best, if not the best in the game. They're ranked number 1 in HP and special attack, number 2 in attack and special defense, and number 3 in defense and speed. This is an amazing type. Granted, this is because most legendaries are Dragon type, but numbers are numbers, and you can't argue with the statistics. Not much else to say here. It's a rare type that I just can't use much in playthroughs. Next we have a 3-way tie between Normal, Bug, and Ice with 8 Pokemon each. Let's start with the Normal type. So, I'm not gonna lie, the Normal type is only here because it shares the type with a lot of flying types. If I didn't count the flying types that shared the Normal type, the total would be like 2 or something. The reason for this is Normal is kind of a mediocre type. In fact, on average, it's one of the worst types in the game. It's the worst type on average in both defense and special defense, making it the least defensive type, statistically at least. It's ranked 17th in special attack, making it the second worst, and its attack is ranked 15th, which isn't much better. On top of those lackluster attack values, the Normal type is not super effective against anything. Its only defensive trait is being immune to Ghost types, but it can't affect them either. It's resisted by Rock and Steel and is weak to fighting. So is it any wonder I hardly ever use the Normal type? Moving on to the Bug type. Now funny enough, if I had done this list like a year ago, Bug would have been at the bottom of this list, even lower than the Rock type. But recently I did an all Bug type run of Sword and Shield, which added 6 Bug Pokemon to the Hall of Fame on its own, but it was also one of the most fun playthroughs I ever did. However, the Bug type is statistically one of the worst types in the game. It is the worst ranked type in HP and special attack, and the second worst in attack and special defense. And on top of that, it is resisted by 7 types in the game. However, this is why I enjoyed my all-bug playthrough so much. It was actually a challenge. Pokemon games are usually very easy, but with the bug type, I really had to strategize in order to win, and it was incredibly rewarding. I used to not like the bug type much at all, but now I like it a heck of a lot more. Moving on to the Ice type. Now most people already know this, but the Ice type is a great offensive type, but the worst defensive type, only resisting itself and being weak to 4 types. On top of that, its biggest claim to fame, which was being the best type to beat the Dragon type, was stolen by the Fairy type in Gen 6. I always have a Pokemon that knows an Ice move in my playthroughs, but it's almost never an actual Ice type using it. It's usually a Water type or something. Ice is another type I really like, but like the rock type, I just can't justify using it with such a weak defensive profile. Honestly, it's only this high on the list because it shares its typing with a lot of water types. Next up is the Dark type with 10 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. So this one is interesting for me. I used to really like the Dark type when I was young and edgy, but now that I've grown up, I'm not a big fan of it anymore. I find a lot of the designs to be too edgy and try-hardy to the point of being a bit cringy. I mean, look at Darkrai. Really scraping the bottom of the DeviantArt OC barrel for that one, weren't you, Game Freak? There are still some good ones out there, but my usage of the type definitely suffered as I grew older. It's still a decent type all around, but due to personal preference, I'm just not one to use it very much anymore. Next we have the Fairy type with 11 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. The Fairy type is one of my favorite types, but since it's the newest type, there aren't that many to use in a playthrough, so it's not as high as it could be. It also means I don't have a ton to say about it. I always want a Fairy type on my team if I can get one, because not only is it a great type overall, it's the best type to counter the strongest type in the game, Dragon. Even if the Fairy type was bad, the fact that it can take on the strongest type and easily win would make it worth using. Just the fact that it's the newest type, yet it's so high on the list, just shows how much I like using it, and I also look forward to using many more Fairy type Pokemon in the future. Next we have a tie between Fire and Steel with 12 Pokemon each. So naturally, Fire, Water, and Grass are going to be high thanks to the starters. But Fire is the one I use the least because outside of starters, it can be hard to find good ones to use, especially in Gen 4, am I right? I would say the Fire type is the best type to beat the tough-to-crack Steel types, since Steels have the best defense on average, but not the best special defense, coming in at 4th best. And since Fire is 3rd best ranked in terms of special attack, it's the best choice to take on the Steels. I think the reason I don't use Fire type much, though, is their weakness to the very common Water and Rock types. These types are very common in a lot of playthroughs, and most Fire types have shallow move pools, so they can't take on these types very well. Fire used to be my favorite type, but that changed over the years, and my usage kind of shows that. It's not bad, but outside of the starters, I don't use it much. Next is the Steel type, easily the best defensive type in the game. And this is pretty much the only reason I love using it. So many Pokemon in normal playthroughs are walled by Steel types. I usually don't use Steel types for their attacking power, as Steel moves are kinda rare and only beat 3 types, which are Ice, Rock, and Fairy. And the Fairy type is the only notable one, as there are much better types to beat Ice and Rock. They also have an immunity to Poison, which is another common type in most playthroughs. So much like the Fairy type, it's another type that I look forward to using more in the future. Next we have another 3-way tie between Poison, Psychic, and Flying at 13 Pokemon each. Let's start with the Poison type. I'll admit the main reason it's this high on this list is because a lot of Poison Pokemon have something else as a secondary type. I actually don't use Poison types for the Poison typing. Before the Fairy type, there was really no reason to use the Poison type alone. It can't hurt Steel types at all, and only beats Grass types, which in the early gens usually had the Poison type anyway. Poison can be a useful status sometimes, but since so many Pokemon can learn Toxic, you don't need a Poison type to inflict it. Much like normal types, the Poison type positions here is more indicative of its dual typing. Now let's talk about the Psychic type. Funny enough, the Psychic type on average is ranked number 1 in special defense. Most people think this type is frail, but no, even its defense is ranked number 8 on average, which isn't bad. Its special attack is ranked number 2 and ranked number 6 in speed. This is a great type overall, which explains why I've used it a lot. It was also overpowered a lot in the early gens. Another reason why I like using this type is the huge move pool of type coverage and support moves. Most Psychic types can learn a huge variety of moves for both offensive and defensive purposes, making it one of the most customizable types in the game. And unlike the normal type, they have the stats to back it up. There were times when I used the same Psychic type Pokemon in multiple generations, but used a completely different moveset each time. Their moveset is that extensive. Now we have the Flying type. Obviously this type is this high because in the early generations we needed Fly to get around, so might as well use a Flying type in battle, right? The Flying type is also very common in most games, so odds are you're going to use one at some point in your many playthroughs. Fun fact, the Flying type is ranked number 1 in speed on average. Yeah, I thought it was electric too. I'll admit, since HMs are no longer a thing, I kinda stopped using the Flying type as much, but I still like the type overall. After all, there are a lot of interesting dual Flying types. Next we have a tie between Grass and Fighting with 14 Pokemon each. Grass is one of the starting types, so naturally it's very high on the list thanks to the starters. However, I use it more than Fire because while Grass isn't the best type defensively, it beats the common Rock and Water types that litter most playthroughs. Also, Grass was my go-to Pokemon catching type. Thanks to many types resisting it, as well as moves like Leech Seed, Poison Powder, Stun Spore, and Sleep Powder, they were optimal for weakening and catching wild Pokemon. Grass is just also really common in most games anyway. The Fighting type was the biggest surprise to me. I had no idea I used it so much. It's a type I always liked, but I thought I didn't use it much. Looking at all the Fighting types I've used in a playthrough though, I think I can kinda see why. Most Fighting types I used were good, but never the MVP. They served small but important roles, but weren't very memorable. They are the unsung heroes of my playthroughs, wielding the highest attack power on average. Next we have the ground type, with 15 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. The ground type is an interesting one. On paper it seems like it would have a lot of flaws. It's weak to water, grass, and ice, very common types. It's only resistant to poison and rock, it can't hurt flying types at all, and only beats electric. However, it's that last one that matters. Ground is the only type that beats electric, and when you're the only type that beats another, you're going to be useful regardless of your defensive profile. I may have only used ground types to beat electric types, but hey, it can't be done by anything else. Sure, it also beats rock, poison, fire, and steel, but other types do it better. Though beating those other types are a bonus considering how common they are. Overall, the ground type is way more useful than it looks on paper, and that's pretty sweet. Next we have the electric type with 16 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. I really like the electric type. This is another type that doesn't seem amazing on paper as it's only super effective against 2 types, is resisted by 3, only resists 3, and is completely destroyed by ground. On top of that, thanks to the average defense and HP of the electric type being very bad, they are usually very frail. So why do I like it so much? A few reasons. First, the types it beats are water and flying, 2 very common types in most playthroughs, and in the world of Pokemon in general. Second, they may have one huge weakness, but it's still the only weakness they have. 3, they're usually very fast. And 4, paralysis, a very useful status effect that halves the opponent's speed and has a 1 in 4 chance of making them not move. Yeah, it's a very useful status effect indeed. I always try to use an electric type when playing through a Pokemon game for the first time, and I always enjoy it. But even so, there's one more type that I use more than any other. Finally, we have the water type with a whopping 27 Pokemon in the Hall of Fame. Water is the most common type in the game and has a lot of dual types, so it's no wonder I've used it so much. The sheer variety in this type makes it viable in pretty much any situation. It has only 2 weaknesses in electric and grass, but there are quite a few water ground types that completely shut down electric types. And as for grass Pokemon, not only do water type Pokemon learn ice moves, but there are water types who have dual types of poison, flying, grass, bug, and even steel, so there are always ways around it. Sure, the dual types add weaknesses, but my point is that dealing with water types isn't as cut and dry as you may think. I've done a lot of mono water type runs in Pokemon, and always end up with a great and versatile team. Sometimes the hardest thing about using a water type Pokemon is deciding which one to use. If I let myself, I could go on forever about the water type, so I'm going to stop here. And that's the list. Tell me down in the comments what type of Pokemon you use most often, and until next time, class dismissed.